the ocean liner. This marvel of Victorian engineering came along and took the world by storm, changing the game for the shipping industry and connecting the world like never before. Passengers who'd once had to brave the ruthless North Atlantic in deplorable conditions on a rickety sailing ship could now make the same crossing in a fraction of the time and do so in unmatched comfort and luxury. It had culminated in a series of ever bigger, ever grander ships. In the Edwardian era, the early 1900s, ocean liners were as much a symbol of status for the elite as they were sources of immense pride for their owners and their home nations. As a focus of national pride, the world's great powers duked it out, not in wartime, but in a battle of tonnage. Bigger, faster, and more beautiful ships. The ocean liner had been supercharged, and it surged ahead, but then disaster. Titanic was lost, and public faith in the ocean liner was shaken, and then came the war. The fine transatlantic liners were put to work as transports, and many were lost. As a consequence, Germany's famous trio of superliners were handed over to the Allies as reparations after the war, and with the dawn of the Jazz Age, it was time once again for the ocean liner to show the world what it was made of, and it was about to do so in a big way. It would see new players rise to take on Britain as the undisputed master of the waves, and the return of a beaten but gutsy nation to challenge the throne for themselves. This was an entirely new generation of ocean liner, from the spectacular Art Deco palaces to the boundary-pushing innovators and the blistering speed demons. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and this is the story of the great Greyhounds of the 1920s. With the flames of war subsiding, the name of the game for most of the world in the early 1920s was stability and recovery. This wasn't a time for pomp and circumstance. The frantic building effort that had driven the development of great ships before the war seemed almost in bad taste. Not only that, but it wasn't the most economical option for most shipping companies to return to a frenzy of superliner building. But the truth was that millions of people still needed to get across the ocean. Troops needed to be demobbed and sent home en masse, whole divisions of them, arriving, waving and smiling in New York and Halifax on the decks of ships that had been designed for luxury in peacetime. The ocean liner was doing an important job, but its development wasn't being driven ahead at breakneck pace like it had before. With Germany out of the game, and its finest ships distributed among the Entente, Britain and America could rest somewhat, and the White Star and Cunard lines operated their new flagships happily into the new decade. As the 1920s arrived, much of what was produced by the world's shipyards were modestly sized, less opulent ships called cabin liners. They were cheaper to run, while the industry worked to once again find its footing. Even the great companies like Cunard and White Star had taken their foot off the gas. Majestic and Berengaria, formerly the German superliners, were passenger favourites, but then were designed before the war. Instead of pushing the ocean liner forward as a concept, instead, Cunard Line busied itself building a fleet of intermediate ships to replace all the ones that had been lost in the First World War. It was a different era. But amidst this caution and frugality, one company across the English Channel had an ace up its sleeve. Thanks to an agreement with the government dating back to 1912, France's Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, CGT, or French Line, found themselves in a position to make good on a contract for 4 completely unique liners to revive the country's passenger trade. The first ship delivered under this agreement was the comparatively small but very fine SS Paris of 1921. She'd actually been laid down way back in 1913, followed by her even smaller running mate, the SS de Grasse of 1924. These ships were beautiful, but they weren't meant to be the stars of the show. No, the real ace up France's sleeve would go on to be considered among the most opulent and beautifully appointed ships of all time, and should be instrumental in bringing one of the world's most beloved design styles to the ocean. Initially, it had been intended that these ships would be completed soon after the agreement was reached between the government and French Line in 1912, but the outbreak of World War I had put a stop to all shipbuilding activity in favour of supporting the war effort. But the year was now 1926, and after over a decade of delays, it was finally time for a new wonder ship to make her debut. Sliding down the ways of the Atelier et Chantier de Saint-Nazaire Penhoe shipyard on March 14th, to the cheers of an enthusiastic crowd, she was every bit as spectacular as her pre-war predecessors. With the crack of a fine bottle of French champagne against her bow, she was named for the very heart of the nation. She was called the SS Ile de France.
Paris au soleil, il n'y en a pas de pareil. Ce sont ces rues qui m'appellent dans le Paris que j'aime.
Introduced at a time when the bulk of the world's remaining large liners were quickly becoming passé, the Ile de France was received by the travelling public as a well-needed breath of fresh air. At a little over 43,000 gross registered tonnes, she wasn't breaking any records in size. It might have made her a competitor way back in 1910, but she was still dwarfed by the 50 and 60,000 tonne formerly German liners. She topped out at around 23.5 knots, so a blue ribbon wasn't on the cards either. That record was still held by the old Mauretania of 1907. No, it wasn't size or speed that made the Ile de France such a sensation. What kept travellers coming back time and time again was something that couldn't be found on any other ship yet built. She was the first ship to bring to sea what would become one of the most defining styles of the Jazz Age, the daring and dazzling style known as Art Deco. The first instances of the style could be traced back as far as 1910's Paris, eventually making its slow and gradual creep to Europe and the US throughout the 1920s. It wouldn't be until 1925, at the International Exhibition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts in Paris, that Art Deco would truly establish itself at the forefront of 1920s design. Known for its daring geometric shapes, sharp angles and bold colours, Art Deco was a vast departure from the flowery motifs found in the Edwardian period, and it would find its first home at sea, for the very first time, aboard French Line's New Beauty. This was largely due to the efforts of one man, the father of Art Deco, Pierre Patou. Patou was a French architect and designer who'd go on to become instrumental in the success of the 1925 exposition, having joined forces with his friend Émile Jacques Ruhlmann to bring the Art Deco style to the public at large. With the resounding success of the exhibition, his contributions eventually led to him being tapped by French Line personally to apply his design prowess to their all-new passenger ship. On her maiden voyage, on June 22, 1927, there was no question that the Ile de France perfectly embodied the motto held by John Dal Piaz, the then president of CGT. Vivre, ce n'est pas copier, c'est créer. To live is not to copy, it is to create. She was not attempting to be a copy and paste job of the kinds of liner that had been built for decades before, overly ornate and grandiose, nor was she attempting to beat the British, Germans and Americans at their own game. Where the great ships that had come before her had paid tribute to classic designs of the past, like Louis XVI and Georgian styles, the Ile de France had an identity all her own, and it was thanks to the forward-thinking design ideals employed by Patou. Had she been completed a decade prior, as originally intended, what resulted could have been an entirely different ship, perhaps one more in line with her Edwardian contemporaries. But so much of what made the Ile de France special lay in the timing of her debut, with tastes rapidly changing and everything many now considered to be old and stuffy design elements being left behind. The Ile de France was widely considered a triumph for her builders and designers. Movie stars, athletes, and even royalty famously stroll her decks throughout her career, making her the darling of the transatlantic set. And you could hardly blame them for being drawn in by her design. Each first-class stateroom aboard the ship was entirely unique, a concept designers had toyed with in the past on other ships, but only truly was perfected on the Ile de France. She was lit throughout by way of indirect lighting, a new design trend that nestled light sources inside vases, mouldings, urns, and sconces, and made clever use of backlighting to give the illusion that the ship was glowing throughout. Like ships before her, she was decorated with a variety of different woods, but rather than rely on heavy, dark carvings to create a sense of richness, the designers of the Ile de France used lighter, airier veneers like palisandre, a variant of rosewood, white maple, and lemonwood layered together to achieve an effect that was both elegant and modern. Her vast public spaces were a feast for the senses, with their towering, arched ceilings and use of angular geometric patterns which followed the Art Deco philosophy to a T. Her grand salon was a perfect example, doing away with the old-fashioned backlit dome of ships from the past in favour of a more utilitarian, but no less striking backlit ceiling at the very centre of the room, surrounded on each side by extravagant, diamond-shaped carvings. Chairs and tables were spread out over the screaming geometric pattern of the carpet, and the entire space was of course bathed in the glow of the warm, indirect lighting. Towering bronze statues lined the walls, and rose-red pillars were huddled together in the corners of the room. It was as though, by setting foot onto the Ile de France, you were stepping forward into the future, and nowhere was this philosophy more apparent than in the ship's first-class dining saloon. If unconventional was the first word that popped into your head on seeing this space, you certainly wouldn't be alone. The dining saloon of the Ile de France was unlike anything ever seen at sea up until that point, a bold statement on the part of her designers that they were not at all interested in the design principles of the past. The room itself gave its guests the sense that they had stepped into the future of ocean travel. Gone was the gold leaf and twirling vines, the intricate carvings and flowery frescoes that had adorned similar spaces on Majestic or Aquitania. Instead, the Ile de France greeted her dining patrons with a dramatic, modern hall with an angular, almost masculine feel. The room itself was towering at over 3 decks tall, making it the largest of its kind at sea. All 537 first-class passengers could dine at once here in this absolute utmost comfort, enjoying selections from a menu containing a staggering 275 separate items paired with countless champagnes, fine wines and brandies sourced from across France. The French are, of course, known for their wine, but this was actually a major selling point for the ship for an entirely different reason. Having been introduced smack dab in the middle of Prohibition, Americans, eager to quench their thirst at sea, jumped at the chance to do so aboard the Ile de France, which offered the largest bar afloat with an almost endless variety of alcohol available to its patrons. Ile de France's menu alone represented something of a monument to the bold, heady excesses of her time, and the ship's popularity was proof that it was paying off. The other first-class spaces found on board the ship were no less striking. To travel at sea in first class had once meant that passengers could haunt the usual saloons, lounges, cafes, and promenades, but the Ile de France brought an entirely new array of spaces to its passengers, from the cinema with seating for 350 guests, a state-of-the-art gymnasium, a merry-go-round for children, and even an onboard garage with room for 60 cars. There was seemingly no end to the modern-day amenities that separated the Ile de France from her predecessors. Second class, as you'd expect, was impressive in its own right, carrying over the same Art Deco design sense that had been employed in first. And the smoking room was designed in a style all its own, with bold, square columns and light fixtures acting like focal points across the room. But probably nowhere more evident was the jump forward in standards of comfort at sea than in third class, where the soft furnishings, the wall panellings and the carpet that was once reserved purely for first and second class on other ships treated the less affluent to an extremely comfortable time on board. This new generation of ocean liner at last did away with the notion of third class as steerage, a body of human cattle able to be crammed into dormitories and bare steel compartments for a week. It was reflected in a name change that set standards across the industry. Third class conjured images of exposed pipes, bad food and creaky bunks. Instead, French Line would refer to it, into the future, as tourist class, a whole new generation of travellers who wanted to voyage on a budget, booked their tickets en masse to see the new world, just for fun. The Ile de France would become the company's most profitable vessel, and the French Line would end their 1928 season with record profits over 1 billion francs for the very first time. They'd struck gold, and by 1935 she had become far and away the most popular choice for the travelling first-class public. But something even bigger was on the horizon. A brand new French wonder ship had spent the better part of the early 1930s undergoing a monumental fitting-out process, and it was almost time for her to make her own grand debut that would take everything the Ile de France had introduced, but upscale it to truly massive proportions. But that, of course, is a story for another day. While France had the market cornered in terms of sheer luxury, Germany knew they needed a plan to reassert their own dominance in the passenger trade. Once upon a time, the mighty Ball trio had made the Germans a force to be reckoned with, but the war had decimated their military and passenger fleets, and their economy wasn't looking too much better either. Help came from overseas in the form of the Dawes Plan of 1924, in which America and other allied nations came to an agreement to assist Germany with rebuilding their economy and paying down their debts. Germany was quick to put this to good use, and by 1926, for the first time in over a decade, the nation was in a position to be competitive in the transatlantic passenger trade once again. Having spent the early years of the 20s knocking together the same kinds of modest cabin liners Cunard and the others had been making, they finally had the capital to give Britain, America and France a run for their money. By autumn 1926, North German Lloyd commissioned a pair of liners that would rival even the Ball trio in size and splendour, and just like their predecessors, they were to be some of the most innovative ships of their age. The technology employed in these vessels was so effective, it would go on to be used even to this day. The first thundered down the slipway in August 1928, and at the top of her sleek bow, she bore the name of a German city that had long given the nation a gateway to the North Sea. She was slick, modern, and fast. She was the SS Bremen. Bremen was many things, but at first glance, she clearly screamed with modernity. Ile de France had been gorgeous on the inside, but from the outside, she still looked like a ship that could have been built in 1913, with her bulky, tall funnels and classic rounded counterstern. Bremen threw the handbook of conventional ocean liner design out the window. Her sharply angled bow led a long and sleek hull that cut effortlessly through the water, but instead of carrying the usual layers of exposed promenade decks, Bremen's hull mounted a slim, covered superstructure that wrapped all the way around the ship and curved elegantly at the front. Sitting over all of it were a pair of short funnels that gave her a silhouette that suggested eagerness to drive ahead like a greyhound straining just before a race. And this was no mistake, because Bremen wasn't just modern, she was fast. Back in 1907, Britain had got to work with intent to overcome German dominance on the Atlantic. The results of their efforts, Mauretania and Lusitania, would go on to set speed records so impressive they would stand for more than 2 decades. But now, 22 years later, it was finally Germany's turn to respond, and respond they did. The Bremen had been laid down at the A.G. Weser shipyard in the town of her name, Bremen, and her running mate, Europa, started construction at the same time at Hamburg's Blohm and Voss yard. At this point in history, it probably seemed that ships had reached the peak of what was possible in terms of sheer speed. The Parsons turbine had sent Lusitania and Mauretania surging through the waves at speeds previously thought impossible, and landed the blue ribbon firmly in the hands of Great Britain. But as they say, necessity is the mother of invention, and for Germany, innovating their shipbuilding and reclaiming their dominance after the war was among their highest priorities. It was time to rethink what a liner could really do, and the secret lay below the waterline, not just in the ship's massive power plant, but in a single striking addition to the hull itself. Protruding strangely, like a massive balloon inflated beneath the water, the sight must have come as a bit of a shock to the public when she was launched. Nothing like it had been seen before on a big transatlantic liner. For the bulk of the last century, ships had maintained the same smooth profile with a sharp, knife-like edge at the bow that seemed ideal for slicing through the water with little resistance. But for the first time ever, this thinking was being challenged. While its appearance may have looked ridiculous to some, the bulbous bow wasn't meant for looks. This purely utilitarian innovation had its origins actually way back in the 19th century, when warships had been fitted with ram bows. But seemingly by coincidence, those fitted with rams seemed to burn less fuel and run quicker. The concept had been developed further by American naval architect David W. Taylor, who had first employed an experimental version of his invention on battleships in the 1910s. Its genius lay in its ability to manipulate physics. As Bremen cut through the ocean, the bulbous bow jutted forward and generated its own wave, counteracting resistance created by the ship's bow wave behind it. This reduced drag and allowed the ship to slice through the water at higher speeds, but without her engines having to work as hard and burn as much fuel. While it wasn't exactly a thing of beauty, it would go on to become a standard on ships even today. And on Bremen and Europa, it marked an all-new milestone in the evolution of shipbuilding. When first introduced, the industry might have wondered how effective this new addition could possibly have been. It would need to prove itself in practice, but it did so with flying colours. On July 21, 1929, Bremen steamed into New York, having made her maiden crossing in a record of 4 days, 17 hours, and 42 minutes. She had raced across the Atlantic at a blistering 28 knots, claiming the blue ribbon that had been held by Cunard's Mauretania for those 20 years. Aside from her bulbous bow, a few other factors were in play that influenced the Bremen's record-breaking speed. Notably, her steel plates overlapped one another facing forward rather than aft, a counterintuitive choice that, along with the addition of the more streamlined Ertz-style rudder at the stern, was actually designed to further reduce drag. Bremen had impressive engines, 4 turbines putting out some 135,000 shaft horsepower, but the ship was reliant on physics to once again land Germany's merchant fleet in the speed record books for the first time since 1903. On a maiden voyage in summer 1929, Bremen glided into New York, having smashed Mauretania's 2-decade record, and a new era had begun. Having been nearly destroyed by fire, Europa would not follow her sister into service until March 1930. But despite the delays caused by extensive repair work and a lengthy fitting out, she was not to be overshadowed. Her maiden voyage was completed in 4 days, 17 hours, and 6 minutes, just 36 minutes quicker than Bremen, but it was enough to claim the blue ribbon fair and square from her sister. She'd hang on to this record for a full 3 years before having it snatched back once again by Bremen. It was an undisputed triumph for Germany, who scarcely a decade prior had seen their entire fleet reduced to next to nothing. It wasn't enough for Germany to simply claim the Atlantic speed record and call it a day. As if to underline that Bremen and Europa were ships for a new age, they were both fitted out with another novel piece of modern-day engineering: an airplane. The idea was to launch an aircraft laden with mail from the upper deck of the ship before arrival in port to speed up the arrival of mail carried aboard. Technically speaking, this wasn't the first time aircraft and ships had been used together for mail service. Earlier versions of the concept experimented with the idea of a reverse shore-to-ship service, but it was seriously flawed. In 1927, a permanent shore-to-ship mail service was offered on the liner Leviathan, but the design was tricky to master and very risky, and the service was discontinued shortly after it was introduced. The Ile de France had made use of its own catapult design for ship-to-shore mail delivery too, but it was the Germans who ultimately perfected the design. The Heinkel HE-12 seaplane had been specifically designed for this express purpose, along with the compressed air catapult meant to launch it. On the Bremen's maiden voyage, the brand new Heinkel seaplane, piloted by Baron Jobst von Studnitz, was launched from the ship's catapult loaded with nearly 11,000 pieces of mail bound for New York. The plane landed around 36 hours prior to the ship's arrival, shaving a good deal of the expected transit time for mail. Upon arrival in New York, the mayor officially christened the aircraft, giving her the name New York, before a crowd of hundreds of enthusiastic onlookers who'd gathered to witness the event. Bremen and Europa are well remembered today for their speed and their technological innovation, but they were also extremely comfortable, and they did away with the kind of Teutonic grandioseness that had long been a staple on German liners. The sisters took a leaf from Ile de France's book, which set a new standard for liners on the grand stage. They pushed the bar with their technology, but designers drew the line there, turning away from avant-garde Bauhaus, but instead leaning into a more generic, modern style. The public rooms were airy and featured warm wood veneers and plush furniture and carpets totally devoid of heavy carvings and gilt detailing. This revolutionary pair of innovative and modern liners was a triumph for their home nation and builders, and their introduction was the shot heard around the world. Britain had been caught resting on her laurels. By 1929, when Bremen was introduced, the two flagships of the greatest British transatlantic carriers were 16 years old. They were still the biggest, but only narrowly, and they were hopelessly slow. North German Lloyd had a pair of Greyhound sister ships that the world's shipping companies must have gazed longingly and jealously at. The tension in Britain turned back to the design office, where plans were put in place to mount a response that would take back the crown and push the ocean liner to its absolute peak. But even before the challenge could be answered, an all-new threat slid down the slipway destined to steal the spotlight from Germany. This new liner wasn't British, she wasn't French, and she wasn't American. She'd been built at Genoa. Italy was a nation with a proud shipbuilding heritage, but never had an Italian ocean liner challenged Britain or the major powers on speed or size, and that was all about to change. In August 1931, the ship was christened before the King and Queen of Italy and slipped away for a maiden voyage to America. Picked out in big lettering on her elegant curved bow was the name that meant king in Latin. It was to prove a fitting title. She was called the SS Rex. Rex was introduced following an intense advertising campaign on the part of her owner's Italian line. She was to be the largest and fastest liner conceived to date by Italy, and no expense was spared in her construction. On the outside, she borrowed a lot from Bremen Europa. The same raked bow, slim curving superstructure and low funnels signposted that Rex belonged to this new generation of transatlantic Greyhound. But on the inside though, in a testament to the Italian eye for old world elegance, Rex leaned more towards classical design styling. There was a small clue to this hint of old world charm, because on the outside, Rex featured an old-fashioned counterstern that had been used on ships like the Umbria way back in 1883. But by contrast, the amenities offered on board were entirely cutting edge. From an onboard printing press used for daily newspapers to a drive-in garage, passengers travelling aboard did so in unmatched modernity and comfort. The inclusion of actual white sand spread around the two outdoor swimming pools, complete with water slides, earned Rex the nickname, the Riviera Afloat. But Rex came about at a time in history when the roar of the 1920s had been reduced to barely a whimper, and the murky shadow of the Great Depression had taken its place. Much like World War I, this economic downturn impacted the shipping world in a big way and spelled major changes to the way even the largest merchant marines would conduct their business. Mergers became the name of the game for those hoping to stay afloat and competitive, and one merger between the three major Italian shipping companies would result in the emergence of this new Italian line. Though the name was new, the companies that formed it were not, and they already had ships that were waiting on the stocks. This would in turn create an interesting twist. The Rex had originally been planned as the SS Guglielmo Marconi, and she was never intended to be introduced alongside a running mate or a sister ship, but she'd find one in a liner that was actually being built to be her competitor. This ship was the SS Conte di Savoia. She came into service the same year as Rex as part of the new Italian line, and the two ships, while radically different, would come to be regarded among the most famous running mates of all time. The builders of the Rex were intent on producing a liner that could compete with Germany's duo of speed queens, so taking a page out of their playbook, Rex was equipped with the now tried and true bulbous bow. She came in at just over 51,000 gross registered tonnes, making her only about 600 tonnes smaller by internal volume than Bremen, but Rex's structure was actually 10,000 tonnes lighter, making her more agile while using less steel. Her beating mechanical heart was the usual arrangement of geared turbines, putting out around 120,000 shaft horsepower to 4 screws. It was less powerful than Bremen and Europa's, but because of her light frame, the engines could work easier to get the same speeds. All this taken together meant that when put to sea, she'd in theory outperform the Bremen and earn Italy their first ever blue-ribbon speed record. But during her sea trials, she'd been plagued by the failure of one of her turbines, reducing her to a disappointing speed of just 28.2 knots, well short of what her builders knew she could do. With repairs in place and thousands of fingers crossed, on September 27, 1932, the brand new SS Rex was sent off on her maiden voyage from Genoa to New York. All seemed well during the first leg of the voyage, with the ship humming along amidst the warm Mediterranean weather and all passengers in high spirits, but the optimism would be short-lived when, steaming off the Spanish coast shortly into the journey, the lights on the ship began to flicker and then died out completely. A serious electrical fault had halted the ship in her tracks, and it might have seemed, in that moment, that the mighty Rex was not all she'd been cracked up to be. Her maiden voyage won no records, but the very next year, in August 1933, Rex thundered across the ocean, hell-bent on showing what she could really accomplish. She steamed into New York after a westbound crossing of 4 days, 13 hours, and 58 minutes, shaving close to 3 hours off Bremen's record, and having maintained an average speed of just under 29 knots. Bremen was dethroned, and for the first time in history, the blue ribbon was held by a ship that came not from Britain, Germany, or America, but Italy. Rex had officially made history, and it wasn't the first nor the last time that she'd do so. Just months before she made her record crossing, famous soprano Rosa Poncelle made a historic performance of Schubert's Ave Maria aboard the ship, which was for the first time ever broadcast by radio to both sides of the Atlantic, simultaneously. And in 1938, the Rex was at the center of a now infamous military exercise when 3 American B-17 bombers were instructed to locate the vessel as far out to sea as possible and intercept it. Passengers waved and cheered from the boat deck, and the photos snapped from overhead would make the front pages of the next day's newspapers, but Italy was very unimpressed with the stunt. One of the reasons why Rex was such a step forward in the story of the ocean liner is because she represented a change in thinking of what big passenger ships could be used for. Back when the ocean liner was first introduced, it was an object of necessity, a way to ferry people across the monumental oceans and unite families and businessmen with their interests on both sides of the Atlantic. The 1800s was a time of unrelenting poverty for much of the world's population. But by the 1920s and 30s, things were beginning to change. Standards of living were improving all the time. It had resulted in the rise of a new class, the middle class, bridging the gap between the ultra-wealthy and the cripplingly poor. This new group of people lived comfortably, and they could travel not out of necessity, but for fun. It's why shipping lines began to shift branding away from third class and steerage towards tourist class. People were travelling for the enjoyment of it, and although the cruise industry was really in its earliest days, Italian Line could see the writing on the wall. Rex was designed not just for the critical transatlantic voyages that people expected, but for pleasure cruises around the Mediterranean. She was fitted throughout with private suites that had their own verandas, but crucially, she had comprehensive air conditioning plant to keep the ship cool in the Mediterranean sun. This marked a turning point in the design of big passenger ships because the cruise industry would one day take over completely. But for the time being, Rex busied herself running back and forth across the Atlantic and then lazily steaming around the Med for fun. She was a hit with the public, which revelled in her cozy interiors and relaxed in the cool, air-conditioned rooms. Of course, Rex wasn't the only thing the Italian line had going for them. Conte di Savoia, her running mate, made her debut shortly after and sported innovations all her own. She was very much her own ship rather than an identical sister to Rex, and her design team had leaned heavily into the dual-purpose role that Rex's designers had aimed for too. Passengers on the Savoia could enjoy a full-size tennis court, all-weather outdoor swimming pools, and even the first ever miniature golf course found at sea. She wasn't as large or as fast as her running mate, but she did feature one important technological addition. A journal would go on to print that the miracle of a stabilized passenger vessel has surpassed that of the bulbous bow. The miracle they were referring to could be found deep within the Savoia's forward compartments below the waterline, an experimental bit of engineering meant to, quote, turn off the waves. 3 massive 750-ton pieces of machinery were the first of their kind seen on an ocean liner, and the Conte di Savoia's builders advertised their ship as rollless. Anti-rolling technology had been toyed with before, most notably with the Fram system that had used tanks on ships like Imperator in the pre-war years. But inventor Lawrence Sperry had improved on the idea and fitted Conte di Savoia with enormous gyroscopic machines that swung against the roll to counteract the ship's swaying. When all worked as intended, these stabilizers succeeded in decreasing the ship's roll from 20 and 30 degrees to just 1.5. But the technology was still far from perfect, and Ultimately, this version of Sperry's design was found to be temperamental and inefficient. But it was an important step forward in enhancing passenger comfort even more. One day, the system would be perfected, but the Conte di Savoia was an important testbed. The years 1920 to 1930 were critical ones for the ocean liner. Arguably, it saw its heyday in these years, with elegant balls and dinners thrown at sea, women in their beautiful, colourful gowns, arm in arm with tuxedoed gentlemen, great dance bands playing into the early hours as the ship beneath them rocked and swayed, gliding over the ocean which had once been seen as an impenetrable wall between the old world and the new. The people who sipped cocktails and foxtrotted carelessly had grandparents who would have remembered the humble beauty of steamers in the 1800s, the terror of being caught in a gale in a ship just 1/5 the size of the one their grandchildren partied in. It was an age of carelessness and decadence, but also decay. It culminated in the stock market crash of 1929, but it could be seen in the world's great passenger ships too. The great liners, which had once set the standard for luxury and comfort, were hopelessly outclassed, and old favourites like Olympic and Mauretania struggled to keep up. Mauretania began to run bargain booze cruises chock full of tipsy university students. It was truly the nadir of the British passenger ship's reign. That and the great flagships Berengaria and Majestic were showing their age. Their shell plating was actually cracking, and they were becoming more and more expensive to run. Just how were these mismatched, aging Edwardian liners supposed to keep up with the sleek, magnificent new machines coming out of French, German, and Italian shipyards? The situation was so bad that the government stepped in. Britain needed a new generation of liner. Plans had been drawn up for a ship of such stupendous size, such monumental power and luxury that she would stand for all time as a symbol that Britain was not to be bested. But while the drawing officers buzzed with idle chatter and the scribble of pens, and this great new ship began to take shape, across the English Channel, French designers, buoyed by the success of the Ile de France and her fleet mates, were working on something to take back the glory from Italy and Germany for themselves. The rise of these two new gargantuan superliners would result in a showdown of truly epic proportions, when two ships a third bigger again than those that had come before them duked it out on the Atlantic in a battle for speed and supremacy that gripped the newspapers and the public and saw the ocean liner reach the very height of its full potential. It's one of the greatest stories of maritime history, but it's also a story for another day.